So it's my great pleasure to welcome Michelle here today. So Michelle did her PhD at the Ohio State University. She studied spider monkeys, and I think she also studied chimps and bonobos during her PhD as well. She worked at the El Soto Biological Field Station on the spider monkeys with some help from some zoo monkeys as well. She then moved to do a postdoc at the University of Illinois, and she bridged two different two different schools there, and she's going to talk about the research that she did during her postdoc there. She's now a newly appointed assistant professor at Marquette University. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to tell us today. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle now to let us know about her research. Thank you, Michelle.
All right, and thank you for having me. And before we get started, I just wanted to tell you guys where I'm coming from as we're all staring at our computers. I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the US right now. And the land that I am on and that my university is on is unceded Menominee, Fox, Mascoutin, Sauk, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk land. And these were unceded territories, basically became part of the U.S. due to a series of treaty violations. And so something I'm getting in the habit of doing is making sure I acknowledge that, because part of creating inclusive environments means that we recognize the way that there are these levels of systemic oppression and that they're still going on in different ways. And with that, I'm going to get started to talk a little bit about stress and stressors and social coping and women of color scientists. So first, I'm going to give you an overview about the experiences of women in science and how the double bind affects women of color. I'll also give you an overview about the stress response and social coping. And then we're going to go over some qualitative data from focus groups looking at the experience of gaslighting of women of color in science. Then I'll present some preliminary quantitative data on stress in women of color in science, and then conclude with thinking a bit about how we can create supportive environments to support women of color in science, but that also should create more supportive environments for everyone. So first, many of us have heard of the leaky pipeline. This is one of many metaphors used to describe the issue in which, as you rise in the scientific hierarchy, there's less and less women. And it frames it as a decline at each stage, but what's problematic about this metaphor is it describes these losses as passive. Women are just lost. And we take our solutions from the metaphors we use. So using that metaphor, there's been a lot of attention on turning up the tap, or recruiting more women to go into the pipeline, or plugging the holes, trying to patch those areas of careers, junctures where women are lost. But it's actually less of a passive leak where women are just lost, but a gauntlet. And the difference between these metaphors is the gauntlet metaphor emphasizes that they're active perpetrators actually pushing women out of science. And those hits can come from supervisors, from coworkers, even students. And to some extent, we know that so much of science is a gauntlet. This cartoon is about the peer review process. It's got a white male scientist trying to get his paper through peer review. And we've got all these reviewers and editors with different weapons to bash him down. We all know and recognize that that process occurs. And so I think it's a really useful metaphor to apply to thinking about the problem of women in science, as well as any marginalized identities in science. And so these barriers occur at every single career junction. So it starts off with recruitment, who gets recruited into labs, who gets recruited into grad school. It occurs with disparities in funding at all different levels of the scientific hierarchy. It involves differences in allocation of resources, and there's these great studies that look at how men get more lab space. And there's disparities in mentoring and who gets more active mentorship. There's also disparities in teaching loads. Women often end up teaching more classes or more intensive classes. And there's disparities of teaching evaluations. Seems like every 6 months there's a new study on this, but it has yet to really impact the way many universities use teaching evaluations. There's disparities in authorship credits, including who in grad labs end up getting included as authors versus just acknowledged. There's disparities in experiences in the peer review process. There's disparities in who gets cited more. There's disparities in who gets invited to speak and give talks. There's huge disparities in service expectations, and more service is required of white women. This is especially true for women of color. And there's disparities in tenure track or non-tenure track positions where basically men are more likely to go on the smoother path of more secure positions with clear research expectations and paths to promotion, whereas women often get onto the temporary teaching track only. And then there's the two-body problem, which affects both men and women, but because of some of those other biases, men are more likely to be the hired spouse, whereas women are more likely to be the trailing spouse. And there's disparities in who experiences incivilities, experiences harassment in workplaces, and even experiencing assault in scientific workplaces. And the result is this is a gauntlet that all women run through, but because so much of this research focuses on women in general, it usually ends up centering the experiences of white women in science. But if we think about women of color, there's additional pressures that's known as the double bind. And we can use the lens of intersectionality to really understand what those experiences are like. So this is the gauntlet for white women. I just described some of those different hits that white women need to experience, but that's what your baseline experience is if you're a cisgendered white woman. If you're a woman of color, you're also going to experience a gauntlet that includes various forms of gender oppression, but there's going to be that additional pressure of racial oppression. And the way that these intersecting forms of oppression work is it's not simply like, here's a gender oppression, here's a racial oppression. They end up working together and often manifesting in new ways that can make it hard to identify the causes of them. But the reality is it's a more intense gauntlet. And this is just considering two axes of oppression. For anyone that has a queer identity, for anyone that's disabled, there's going to be additional intersecting oppressions overlaid upon this experience. And the result is a gauntlet that looks very different from the gauntlet that either white men or white women are experiencing in the scientific trajectory. And so this cartoon really illustrates that well. We've got a white man here. He has to run over some hurdles. For this woman of color, she's got a shackle to her ankle, and she's got all sorts of scary, terrible obstacles that are far more than those hurdles. That is stressful. And that's where we get into thinking a bit about the stress response and social coping. So broadly, embodiment refers to the way that our experiences, in this case social, lead to physiological responses that can produce biological changes. And one of the ways that this works is through the HPA axis. So this is the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. Basically, a stressor triggers this hormonal cascade, and your brain signals your adrenals to release glucocorticoids, which release glucose into the circulatory system. So that glucose, really good if you are actually running a physical gauntlet or running away from a predator. But when this is activated regularly in your day-to-day life, that can have negative health impacts. And that's where social support can be really important. Social support is linked to a whole bunch of short-term and long-term health benefits. And much of consideration of social support looks at just general social support, what your support network is as a whole. I've focused a lot on the importance of friendship, particularly female friendship. So in grad school, I became interested in the 10 and befriend hypothesis, which posits that female friendship is very important for women to cope with stressors. And I studied that in spider monkeys for my PhD. I've since continued to study it in a couple of different projects on humans. And there's a lot of literature as well on loneliness, what the harm of not having social support does to you. And I should add too, there's also much of the loneliness literature emphasizes the perception of social support. So it's not just what your actual social network is, but your perception of how accessible or reliable your social network is. And so combining those different lines of research, I was really interested in understanding how social stressors and social support are embodied in female scientists. So there's a few different components to this study. And so the first study I'm going to talk about is the qualitative data. And so this was via focus groups, focusing entirely on women of color scientists at different ranks. So they were non-tenure track, tenure track, and tenured. And so we had 15 women participating in those focus groups. And that's the study that I'll be discussing next. The next component was quantitative data. Once we know what those experiences are, can we quantify them and measure them? And so based on some of that pilot data from the qualitative data, we developed these daily surveys and also collected urine for urinary hormones for approximately 1 month. Basically 1 menstrual cycle or 40 days if women weren't cycling regularly. And we had 20 female scientists of color and 20 white female scientists. And so here I have a little caveat of what I'm presenting here. We looked at 20 female scientists of color. When I present you the data, it's going to be on a subset of them, about half. The reason for that is I finished all of collection for both groups in December 2019, and I ran the assays and finished the last of the women of color assays at the end of February. Unfortunately, our lab shut down about March through June. What that meant was some of the undergrad assistance with doing some of the specific gravity so we could correct those urinary hormones was still in progress, so I'm missing a few of those. There are grad students working on that this semester though. And the assays for the white female scientists didn't get done. We get these multiplex ELISAs from Quantitative. They were in the process of manufacturing them and hadn't fully sent all of it out before the lab shut down. So we don't have that data yet. The good news is after some scrambling for extra funding, we now have the funding to actually send those back to Quantitative for their text to run, and that should hopefully get sent out by the end of the semester. So finally, we will have some solutions, but the full data set's going to wait a little bit longer. So first, I'm going to talk about the qualitative data from focus groups. And so this is a paper that's in press. It hasn't officially been published, but we've sent the final version, so it should be out shortly. And we were really interested in the ways in which negative workplace experiences interact with social exclusion or inclusion. So we have these three types of negative experiences. There's incivilities. These are low-level, kind of ambiguous, rude experiences that happen on a daily basis for many in science. So there are things that are really subtle, things like You just are excluded from camaraderie, or you're introduced to someone and they shake everyone else's hand and look everyone else in the eye and ignore you. And then there's gender and racial harassment. Whereas incivilities are ambiguous and you can't attribute them to cause, gender and racial harassment occur when you can clearly attribute it to this was a gendered remark, or this is a racial remark, or this is a form of microaggression or macroaggression occurring that is linked to gender or race. And so we consider those all together as negative workplace experiences. And we expected that rank and social identity would influence how often those were occurring, but that it would be social exclusion versus inclusion that would really impact how it's affecting women's psychology and productivity. So first I'm going to talk about incivilities, because across the board, everyone, non-tenure track, tenure track, tenured, were experiencing incivilities most often. In every focus group, there were a couple incidences brought up of gender harassment or racial harassment, but the incivilities were much more frequent. And what was really striking is the incivilities come in all directions. They can come from superiors, administrators, department heads. They can come from your colleagues and peers, but they were also coming from students. They were also coming from administrative staff. They were really just coming in all direction. And it's even for tenured professors, they're still getting that same level of incivilities from students, from administration, in all directions. What we also found was that there was this pattern that we call collegial gaslighting. So to explain gaslighting, it comes from this movie, Gaslight. It's basically where someone denies or minimizes that your perceptions of something that you've experienced are real or valid. And the reason that we use the term collegial is in many cases when the gaslighting happened, it wasn't intended to intentionally mislead. It was usually offered in what was thought to be a supportive or friendly manner. So to use an example, there was one woman who she was feeling very threatened because there was a racial threat made on campus. And she was talking to a white male colleague about her fears about how that racial threat affected her sense of safety on campus. And her colleague, in an attempt to be reassuring, is like, oh, you just don't have to worry about that stuff. Just put your head down and ignore it. It's not a big deal. And that sort of thing happens a lot. And it's often trying to be reassuring, but it's denying the severity that those things happen. These sort of things also happen a lot when people of color bring up some of the more subtle forms of racial oppression, or when they recognize that there's more incivilities directed their way. And often well-meaning colleagues just don't see it or don't want to see it, and so they deny that it occurs, or they minimizes the impact it should have. What happens is that leads to attributional anxiety. When you are experiencing something and everyone is telling you you're overreacting, or it didn't happen, or it wasn't a big deal, you start to question whether your internal compass is correct. You start questioning how you're feeling, whether your experiences are valid, whether your perceptions are valid. And that is very anxiety-provoking. And so from these focus groups, we came up with a model that described how women were coping with that process. And this is where isolation versus social support becomes very important. Women that reported more isolation, not having other women of color to check their experiences, or having white colleagues that could be bystanders that would call it out, experienced internalized gaslighting. They questioned themselves and whether their perceptions were valid. Oh, hold on a second.
And the low will be 28.
My phone thought I was talking to it. So that leads to uncertainty, something that came up again and again in these focus groups where women were asking, is it me? Is it because of my research? Is it because people don't like me? Whereas women that had better access to social support and social support networks experienced meta-awareness, where they could take their own experiences and put them in perspective, particularly considering the broader lens of gender and racial oppression, and realize there's a cause for it. The recognition where they said, I know why this is happening. It isn't because of me or my science. It's because of these systemic factors that are working against me. And that places the locus for control outside of yourself, which is very reassuring and reduces some of that stress. But the thing is, some women had better access to those support networks than others. So here is a quote from a non-tenure track participant who is probably experiencing one of the worst forms of kind of escalating incivility and harassment. And she said, you have to try to survive, right? Otherwise, what do? You're either depressed from time to time, so you want to get out, right? Either you commit suicide or you kill someone, right? You don't want to go that way, so you talk to a friend to try to relieve that. And so this participant really got to both the most severe mental health impacts of those experiences, and also the recognition you don't want it to impact you that way, so you rely on social support to try and ameliorate that. But if your experiences at work are that bad that you can't, the social support isn't enough. And that's why we really need to both provide more venues of accessing that social support, but also reduce those incivilities and that harassment. And both of those really need to happen together. So in summary, women of color in science experience high levels of incivilities that come in every direction, and that experience of collegial gaslighting causes them to question whether those experiences are valid and real. Social support can validate them. It validates that those experiences are real, and it validates that those are due to systemic forms of racial and gender oppression. I really want to highlight this because it's such an important point. When we think of these incidents of incivility or harassment, we often think of, okay, there's one person or a few bad apples perpetrating them. But what creates the culture that fosters that is cultural, it's institutional, it's systemic. And right now in the United States, there is an executive order that actually prohibits doing research on these topics. It prohibits doing diversity trainings that call out and name systemic racism. If I had federal funding, I'm not sure I could be talking to you guys right now about this, but fortunately, I am not federally funded. So I'm going to use that advantage to really emphasize we need to name the problem and we need to keep on acknowledging the problem. Part of the gaslighting is saying these things aren't real and making them invisible. And part of solving these problems are acknowledging that this entire scientific culture, many of the institutional cultures and national and regional cultures that we're working under have forms of racial and gender oppression embedded in the culture. And we need to recognize that those negative experiences do impact mental health. And nearly every focus group, women brought up that they recognized that and that they needed to do extra self-care and seek out therapy, support groups in order to cope with it. But it shouldn't just be on individuals to do more self-care. We need extra community care to cope with them, but we really need to, as I said before, reduce the incidence of these experiences and increase the supportive networks to tackle this problem in both directions. And so from there, we know that there are mental health impacts. So the quantitative data was to get at some of the physical impacts and how this affects women of color's health. So we collected daily surveys from women of color. Basically, there were several surveys embedded in one page that they'd fill out each day that they were also collecting urine samples. And these were basically collected for about a month, a mean of 32 days. And so some of the surveys that were included were looking at workplace incivilities, looking at daily social support, and I've got the social support survey here, and it's divided between types of social support from friends, family, partners, and also having them rate how supported they felt. We also have indications of sleep duration and sleep latency, or time to sleep, which I'll talk about here. And then somatic symptoms of depression. So these are physical symptoms, things like headaches, stomach aches, backaches, that often together can point to some of the more somatic experiences that co-occur with depression and anxiety. And then we had urine samples from the multiplex assay. We could look at cortisol concentrations. And so most of the data I'm going to present is from the first 10 participants, though there's one slide where I have some data from 15 participants. And so first, these are daily mean workplace incivilities. And so this was on a scale of 1 to 7, basically 1 to 7 types of workplace incivilities experienced each day. And the good thing is, for most of this subset of women, they were fairly low on a day-to-day basis, but the unfortunate thing is for the women that were experiencing them, it tended to be a daily occurrence. For these 3 women that you can see these bigger bars for, they were experiencing those daily incivilities, usually a couple of them a day, basically on a daily basis. So we kind of have these 2 pools emerging where some are experiencing low incivilities and some are experiencing high incivilities. And of course, this is only on 10 women, but we're going to reanalyze once we have the full data set. And those daily mean workplace incivilities were correlated with racial microaggressions. And so the calendars basically had these daily surveys of incivility, but we also had a one-time racial microaggression survey. And I probably would not have looked at this as soon as I did, or I actually wasn't the one that initially looked at it. It was a freshman in the lab who was really interested in microaggressions and wanted to compare these two. And so for her end of the year project with this researcher program, the Researchers Initiative, she took the lead on looking at these, and they are correlated, which suggests that basically women that are experiencing racial microaggressions are experiencing higher rates of incivilities, which isn't surprising at all. There's a lot of literature on selective incivilities, but this really supports that these are 2 very related experiences. Microaggressions are what in the previous study we would describe as racial harassment, but incivilities, even though we can't always attribute the cause, are more likely to occur when you're also experiencing forms of racial oppression. And here we have data on sleep latency, time to fall asleep. And so here's where the social support data gets a little bit conflicting, but basically on days when women were talking to friends, they were more likely to take longer to fall asleep. On days in which they were talking to partners or family, they fell asleep faster. And these were significant for all 3 types of relationships. Then we have somatic symptoms. There were slightly different relationships between friends and family and partners, but none of these were significant. And then we have cortisol concentration and those forms of social support. Not much of a relationship for talking to friends or talking to family, but talking to partners. On days they were talking to family, cortisol concentration was higher. And then Here are sleep latency at the top and somatic symptoms at the bottom, looking at social media use. So there was no relationship with sleep latency, but on days that women were engaging in some sort of social media use, they had significantly higher somatic symptoms. Those feelings like headaches, backaches, stomach problems. And then here is cortisol with that social media use. On days when women were engaging in some form of social media use, those days they had higher cortisol concentrations. But to put that all together, I ran a series of general linear mixed models, basically trying to see which of these factors are associated with daily variation. So for the first GLMM, talking to partners was significantly negatively associated with sleep latency. So talking to partners associated with falling asleep faster. A similar pattern was found with somatic symptoms. Talking to partners was significantly negatively associated with those somatic symptoms. So talking to partners, less of those physical symptoms. And then I looked at daily variation in cortisol concentration. So in that GLMM, those somatic symptoms, as well as social media use, were both significantly positively associated with cortisol concentration. So on those days in which they were experiencing somatic symptoms and or engaging in social media, they had higher cortisol concentrations. And so I want to emphasize that these are all very preliminary data, and we'll be looking at this with a much larger data set. But from this preliminary data, it looks like partners appear to be the strongest and most consistent form of social support, but that may be due to limited sample. In those first 10, I think about 7 had partners and 3 did not. I would expect, depending on whether you have a partner or not, you'd have a trade-off between friend or partner and family social support. So once we have the data from both the women of color and the white women, I'm hoping to just look at these social factors and look at those potential trade-offs. But the preliminary data suggests that somatic symptoms, as well as social media use, have the largest impact on daily variation in cortisol. And there weren't any direct effects from social support, but there looks like there's a potential for indirect effects of social support affecting somatic symptoms and then cortisol. Of course, as I said, these are really preliminary results, and I want to wait till I have a little more data before I say anything too conclusive. I have been asked if this has made me reconsider my social media use, and personally, as someone that has been living alone in isolation for about 8 months now, I'm still going to continue using my social media. I wouldn't get too worried about it right now, but it's something we need to consider looking at in more detail. I want to move on now to finally considering how can we create supportive environments. And I want to say, going into this project, I thought the important part was documenting these patterns that exist, and that is very important, but sometimes we often want to wait and want more data and keep collecting more data before we act. And one of the things I found in this project is there is quite a lot of qualitative data, and if we just looked at that data, listened to women of color's experiences, we would already have a lot of the answers, and sometimes we're just delaying on acting on it. And there's a lot we can do right now to begin creating better, more supportive environments from women of color in science. And I should say this is focusing a lot on women of color, but it's applicable to many other marginalized identities in creating more inclusive science in general. And the first is there need to be cultural and institutional changes. And we need to start with naming those problems. Naming systemic racism, naming systemic sexism, naming all the forms of oppression that are causing hostile environments. And we need to recognize how our broader culture is contributing to those. And we need to address those problems, looking at the biases that are leading to imbalances in terms of recruitment, hiring, funding, etc. But we can't just keep on doing that thing we do where we recruit and push people through the pipeline. We need to look at how we're actually creating inclusive and supportive environments and how we're retaining women of color and other marginalized identities. And it is a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, but we really actually should focus on changing the culture before we push more people in. And when I was working on a commissioned report for the National Academy of Sciences looking at these issues, I ended up going to the committee and presenting some data from primatology. And I showed a figure from ADESI 2012, basically that showed that primatology is a field where there's a lot of undergrads interested, and at the early stages, there's way more women than men. But it starts to even out around the assistant professor phase, or I guess would be the lecturer phase for you guys in the UK. And then by the time you get to the highest levels at full professor named chair, there's more men than women in those positions. And primatology has been hailed as this great, more female inclusive feminist science. But the problem is you can have tons of women going in, but you're still going to lose them at those different stages unless we change the culture to make sure that those women are retained. And that's especially true when we look at women of color or any other marginalized identity. So we can take steps right now to start changing that culture. One thing we can do is promote women of color to leadership positions. And that's because women of color recognize these experiences to get to that leadership position. And we also need to support women of color leaders by actually providing institutional funding to actually make those changes. And one thing we can do is engaging in sponsorship rather than just mentoring. So mentoring often refers to giving career advice or hands-on feedback to improve. Sponsorship involves actively trying to advance careers by connecting to networks, including on collaborative projects, nominating for awards. One thing that came up in the focus groups that mirrors a lot of other literature, women of color are often excluded from many of these networks. Women in the study described how they would get excluded from recognition from their departments. They would see white men or white women get nominated for awards, often when even things like service awards where the women of color are doing the bulk of the work. And so recognizing and making extra steps to sponsor can make a difference. And then there's cohort hiring, something that was brought up in those focus groups. There were a few women that were hired as a cohort together, and that meant they had this built-in social support network. And that has become a bit of a trend in the US to have these cluster hires or cohort hires where people, usually marginalized identities or focusing on topics such as race, are being hired together. I was actually hired as part of a cluster hire, somewhat like that, that's been occurring over several years across departments. And we need to have institutional support for women of color networking groups. And so part of the problem is often in your departments, you might be one of the only or one of a couple. I'm in a department that's slightly better. I have one other woman of color in the department, and I'm sure she's excited that I've now joined the department because for a very long time, she was the only one. But there's a lot of ways in which you can do better about connecting women across campuses, across disciplines, so that they have access to those networks. And we need institutional support for anti-racism efforts. And one thing that's clear across the board, a lot of times diversity initiatives are kind of lauded, but then not given the institutional support to succeed. And something that was brought up again in those focus groups is poorly thought out diversity initiatives end up being a form of gaslighting, where universities will point to him and say, look, we're inclusive, without actually making the real culture inclusive and expecting faculty of color to stay quiet about the ways it's non-inclusive. And finally, I want to emphasize there is a lot of interest in DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but that's not enough. We can't just recruit more diversity and say, look at these diverse people, unless we're really letting them feel like they belong, feel like diverse identities are valued, rather than forcing people to assimilate to certain cultural values. We can't just say, well, now we have equity, unless we address the years of systemic inequities that have led us to the present. And we can't just focus on including marginalized identities unless we're actually giving people of marginalized identities the same opportunities to be leaders, giving their words the same value as we do white men or white women. And last, I want to emphasize we need to decolonize, because without decolonization, we end up just replicating white supremacist values and expecting people of color to assimilate to that dominant culture. And so I do want to address, there's a lot of confusion about the word decolonizing and concerns it gets watered down. In its strongest form, decolonizing really means giving land back to Indigenous people and restoring and supporting cultural rejuvenation of cultures that have been oppressed and have been under pressures to assimilate, cultures that language has been suppressed, cultures that religious or different forms of cultural celebration have been either deterred or absolutely forbidden. So there's a lot of work to do on that. But part of decolonization also means correcting the white supremacist cultural lens at which we look at our histories and our disciplines. So, for example, in teaching evolution this semester, I've really tried to change how I teach. So instead of it being this parade from Aristotle to Darwin, we're looking at some of the contributions of people of color, some of the contributions of Muslim scholars that haven't been acknowledged. And we also want to think about correcting those power imbalances between researchers from dominant cultural identities and from Western nations, and researchers from marginalized or minoritized populations, and especially, as I've gotten into thinking a lot about in primatology, making sure that people from non-Western countries are getting the same recognition and acknowledgement, as well as supported with things like funding. So there's a lot of work to do, but we have steps we can take to do that. And that's basically it for this presentation. I do want to acknowledge that this was a lot of work, and there's a lot of people and collaborators and funders that helped make it happen. And so the two labs that I worked with were the Clancy Lab at University of Illinois and the TAL Lab, or Elizabeth Stein-Moreau's lab, also at University of Illinois, and our colleague Ruby Mendenhall. We also had an ecosystem of undergrads that did a lot of work with data entry and labeling tubes and aliquoting samples, as well as some grad students now that are helping out with that. We also have a couple of additional collaborators helping us with the last bit of funding. I wanted to acknowledge most of this work was funded by the Beckman Postdoctoral Fellowship, but I also had funding from the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, and the last component was funded by the Leonard Wren Foundation. And we need to really recognize part of decolonization is making sure we realize when we talk about a study, it's never just one scientist, but that whole ecosystem and support network that makes the science happen. And so that's it. So we can open it up to questions now.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. yeah, so there's a couple of comments saying thanks for the amazing talk. I would reiterate that. So before we jump into the questions, I just want to plug next week's seminar that will be given by Jerry Carter, who's going to talk about cooperation in bats for a complete phase shift. So as usual, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise a hand if you can figure out how to do that, or drop it into the chat function, or if there's a pause and you can't figure out how to raise a hand, also just jump in to ask any questions. I'm sure that there are going to be lots. I have many myself, but I'm not going to abuse my privilege yet, and see if anybody has any questions to ask. If not, I am going to abuse my privilege, but I'll give it a second. No. Okay. In that case, while people are thinking, can I ask about the data that I know that you've reiterated that it's preliminary, the cortisol results, and it's a small sample size. But I wonder if the relationship can be the other way around. So there seems to be a correlation between days where an individual is feeling less stressed and talking to their partner. Is it that they could just be talking to their partner when they're feeling less stressed and have more space for it, rather than feeling less stressed because they've talked to their partner?
Yeah, so we can't really parse out, at least with that particular analysis, we can't parse out causality. I'm hoping once we have more data and we can find some new ways of looking at it, we might be able to do more of kind of a time-lagged analysis, or potentially a week-by-week analysis to tease out directionality, but I'm not certain whether we'll really be able to sort those two things out.
Cool. And do you have any baseline data that's like in the published literature that you could compare to? Maybe not, because it's quite a the causality is quite specific. I was just wondering whether, in general, like men in academia have lower cortisol levels than women and women of color in academia, for example.
So I don't know of any research that really kind of looks at those factors in relation to cortisol, but part of the other issue besides just not having those comparisons is because there's so many different things that can affect cortisol measurements and a few different ways of going about measuring cortisol. It's really hard to directly compare studies. And so usually it's not too typical to be doing these sort of daily measurements. What's more common is usually doing a few days of several time points throughout the day. And there's trade-offs of what that's useful for and what it's not. But the frustrating thing is it gets really hard to compare data from different studies because of these different methodologies and time frames.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's amazing. It's an amazing data set, and I'm so surprised that you got so many women to agree to pee in a cup every day for over a month.
It was hard. And especially the women of color phase started much earlier than collection for white women, but they finished up around the same time. And part of that was just finding enough women of color, and then having women of color that actually completed and returned it was really tough. And we allowed for, if you have to go on a weekend trip, you cannot collect. But one of the problems we came across was a lot of women of color in academia have such busy schedules, and especially travel schedules, that collection was really tough to do.
Wow. Cool. Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise I get to abuse my privilege again. Natalia?
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for the fantastic talk. I think I learned a lot today. I actually I couldn't hear all of it, so perhaps if you already answered that through your talk, I'm sorry. But do you plan to address the role of social hierarchies in your future studies? Because I've seen studies like that before. Sorry, I'm talking in lower voice because my daughter is taking a nap. So because there are previous studies about how social hierarchies also affect the behavior in academy, and I'm assuming that it will correlate with cortisol, perhaps?
So in the qualitative studies, we basically did a very simplistic hierarchy of just the tenure versus tenure track. With both women of color and white female samples, we had grad students, postdocs, and tenure track faculty, as maybe also, well, we included postdocs and non-tenure track together. So we do have some different levels of hierarchy, and so in the next models, we want to include that as a factor. However, the tricky thing is they are somewhat imbalanced samples. We have a lot more graduate students and postdocs than we do faculty. And so, for example, we wouldn't be able to separate out their tenure track versus tenured faculty because there's not enough of them. They'd just be lumped together as faculty. And so right now we're kind of trying to figure out what's the best way to account for including that as a variable in the model. But because of some of those biases in sampling, I'm not certain we'll really be able to tease that out effectively.
Megan?
Hi, really interesting talk. Sorry if you mentioned it and I missed it, but did you look at different disciplines? Because as an anthropologist, I find like there's lots of women within our department and it's really great. But I would assume that if I was in like the mathematics department or something, then it might be quite different and there might be quite a different culture.
Yeah, so we didn't specifically look at different disciplines. We did recruit widely from social, natural, physical sciences, and engineering. And so with both the focus groups and the quantitative data, we have a sampling from across those fields. We might be able to separate it out into maybe 2 or 3 categories, but I'm not sure we have the right distributions to specifically look at that as a variable. I'll have to go back through some of that demographic data and see if that's possible. One of the things that's come across in some of the research that I've done for the lit reviews on this is there absolutely are these different cultural contexts. And I think there's really need for follow-up studies that are specifically looking at those different domains, but because of kind of the challenges of recruitment, particularly how hard it is to recruit women of color just because there aren't a lot, it's hard to get the numbers to really do those comparisons.
Siri?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Michelle. I would just thank you for a really amazing talk. I also just wanted to ask, you mentioned it briefly, but about people who have sort of identify as queer, and maybe if you plan to do something on that kind of demographic group or anything, because just personally I'm white, but I identify as queer. And I think it would just be really interesting to see how that group kind of compares to, for instance, women of color and how they're sort of treated in a scientific environment.
So I haven't, though during the focus groups, that was something that was briefly brought up, but there is a graduate student in the Clancy lab, Mary Wilson, and she's also one of the people that's been kind of taking over, finishing up these samples and getting them out, but her dissertation project is going to be looking at a range of sexualities and gender orientations. So she's kind of trying to recruit as much of a gender and sexuality inclusive sample and look at, I believe, cortisol variation, though it's been a while since I've talked to her about her project, but I believe that's what her plan is to do. However, I think in terms of trying to compare different groups, I think that ends up being kind of a messy thing, both because it's hard to neatly separate out groups, and it's also hard to neatly separate out those experiences and see where there's differences and overlap. So I think it's with a lot of research that's taking an intersectional lens, as much as we want to look at multiple intersecting forms of oppression, it's really hard to do without kind of separating it out and looking at one or two axes at a time, just because it's messy.
Mark has a question, but can't raise a hand as a host.
Yes, I'm not sure what that's about. Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. Perhaps lots of people in the audience are aware of this, but I wasn't aware that there were these restrictions on what you can and can't do with federal funding. That's, well, I was shocked to hear about that, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more.
Yeah, so, this is a newer executive order. I think it went into effect about a month ago. I actually haven't read through it in detail because I saw it and I didn't even want to read it. And I basically took the advice I heard on Twitter that if I had federal funding, I should look into that. But I've mostly just read about how universities are responding to it and kept an eye on some of the emails that my institution has put out. But basically, it's caused a lot of confusion because right now universities are taking different steps to figure out, does this apply to us? Should we err on the safe side? And there's a lot of confusion about it. And I would say for me personally, I'm trying to focus on the fact that where we are now means hopefully in January, we will not have to deal with this. So I'm personally not going to worry about it, but it is a major concern for anyone doing this sort of research that has federal funding right now. It's been a big concern for universities trying to figure out how to hold diversity trainings or anti-racism trainings, if they can still allow those. And they're interpreting it and going in all different directions and trying to comply with it. So there's not a lot of complete understanding or agreement of it.
Fair enough, thanks, yeah.
We next have a question from Elisa and then Pankuri.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering whether you think it's worth it to control for personality in these correlations you are making with, like, to see if personality may affect because maybe personality may affect how these changes of these sensibilities affect changes in cortisol level or in the somatic symptoms or the physical symptoms?
No, that's not something we've looked at. I think that could be an interesting angle to look at in the future, but it was just, as it is, there's too many variables to deal with. So I think I'm hoping some future follow-up studies will take different pieces and follow up on some of those questions. But it was definitely, I think, planning this research really tough, trying to figure out what to include and what was too much to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pankuri, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, hi, Michelle. Thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it. So one question that I had was when cultures are not inherent to that one particular country, but it immigrates with the people from another country. Like I'm an Indian and I have relatives living in the US, and I come from a privileged class in India. But the underprivileged here, as it is, their immigration to developed countries would be less. But when privileged classes go and settle abroad, they take that inherent, like casteism with them. So how do you address that in a scenario of a society that has those problems, but it isn't inherent to them? Like, how do you address it in the context of, say, US?
Yeah, so that's not something I really dealt with directly in this project. In the focus groups, we did have a couple immigrant women that did bring up some of these issues. There's also, I don't think this actually made it into the paper, but there was something that a South Asian American woman brought up about her experiences of being in a predominantly East Asian lab and some of the intersections of kind of cultural norms and patriarchal privileges, and just some of the dynamics where, as an Asian woman, she could see some of the dynamics that I think some of the white students were not understanding, and the ways in which those cultures interacted. With my project, that was just, there wasn't really something we could do much with that. I do think there's some really interesting research, though, or discussions that hopefully include research coming out of the tech culture, particularly in Silicon Valley, about the ways in which casteism has been affecting dynamics in tech. And I think for disciplines that are very heavily reliant on immigrant scientists, there's a lot of room to do that sort of research, particularly, I know this has been brought up to me with physics and computer science being a couple of those disciplines where they're very actively recruiting graduate students, postdocs, faculty from East and South Asia. And there ends up being, I've actually thought about it a little more from the perspective of immigration and visas, simply because there was a project I was involved on that ended up not getting kind of on the ground, but was looking at the experience of immigrants on campuses, basically looking at the stresses of immigrants in response to some of the constant changes in immigration law that has been occurring in the U.S. over the past 4 years. But unfortunately, that project didn't get off the ground. I'm hoping there's some other projects that are looking at that can yield a little more data on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else have any questions? We've got still a little bit of time if Michelle is willing to chat with us a bit longer. Well, then I will abuse my privilege again. So can I ask about sponsorship and at what level you think, well, I imagine sponsorship would be most effective if it was top down. I guess what I'm asking is whether it could be bottom up for those people who are in my lower positions, lectureship or assistant professorship, I guess. Yeah, do you think sponsorship could be effective if enacted by somebody at our level?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think sponsorship is most effective if it's from someone that comes from slightly higher up, but it's even like within, like ranks, like a postdoc can't officially do much to be a sponsor of, say, an assistant professor, but they can be a sponsor to a graduate student or an undergrad. Graduate students don't have a lot of power, but they can be sponsors to undergrads. And sometimes it is possible to be a sponsor to someone at your own rank or around the similar rank. So, for example, one thing we can do is if there's awards we can nominate someone for, obviously those nominations look better if they're coming from higher ranking people, but depending on the type of award, sometimes having several people grouped together and all write a nomination award, even if they're coming from a similar rank or just one above, can make a difference. And so what I think about in terms of what's an effective way to be a sponsor is to think about, are there things you can nominate for that are recognitions? Can you make sure you're promoting someone else's work? Or being inclusive on collaborations and authorship, things like that. And I would say especially too, something that's always kind of been a bit of a mystery to me is things like speaking engagements, when there's that disparities in who gets invited. And it took me a long time to realize that like a lot of the initial level of you getting a speaking engagement is talking to your friends at other universities and being like, hey, I'd like to give a talk there. And so most of my initial invited talks have been a few hours away where I visit a friend and give a talk. And I would say this is actually probably the first speaking engagement I've had where it's come from people I didn't know. And so some of that kind of lower level type stuff that maybe is not as prestigious still gives you a bit of a leg up.
Thank you. Super helpful. We still have a couple, like maybe 5 more minutes for questions if people are, if people have anything else that they want to bring up. No. I'm going to give it 1 more minute. Okay. Well, if there really aren't any more questions, I just want to say thank you so much again for taking the time to chat to us today. I found this super helpful, and I'm going to send it to everybody in the department to listen to it. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you do get to continue with both primatology and your work on, and your work on humans. It's super fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's really been my pleasure. Well, I'm going to say our pleasure, but certainly mine. Cool.